The story of the American Revolution is often told as a tale of perfect unity, a triumphant brotherhood of visionary men standing shoulder to shoulder against tyranny, bound by shared ideals of liberty, equality, and freedom. Yet the deeper historical reality is far more complex, fractured, and human than the polished myth that has survived through textbooks and monuments. The men we call the Founding Fathers did not always agree, did not always trust one another, and in many cases deeply resented each other's motives, methods, and visions for the future. They fought not only against the British Empire but also against one another, through words, through political maneuvering, and sometimes through near-open sabotage. This documentary asks a question history rarely dares to confront directly: were the Founding Fathers actually united, or was their so-called unity merely a fragile alliance stitched together by necessity, fear, ambition, and survival? To answer this, we must strip away the heroic marble statues and return to the dusty taverns, secret letters, bitter debates, and blood-soaked battlefields where distrust, rivalry, and competing visions of America were just as powerful as any shared dream. This is not the story of perfect harmony, it is the story of controlled chaos that somehow gave birth to a nation. The American Revolution did not begin with muskets fired in open battle, nor with bold declarations spoken from grand halls. It began quietly, slowly, and unevenly, growing out of decades of unresolved tension between Britain and its American colonies, tensions rooted not only in politics but in economics, geography, class, and identity. For more than a century, the colonies had lived under a system of British rule that was distant, inconsistent, and often indirect. This distance allowed the colonists to develop their own assemblies, their own trade networks, and their own sense of independence long before anyone openly spoke of rebellion. Many colonists still considered themselves loyal English subjects, proud of their connection to the crown, but they were also becoming something new, Americans, shaped by opportunity, self-rule, and a frontier spirit that clashed with imperial control. This quiet evolution created a dangerous contradiction. The colonies were loyal in name, but independent in practice. The turning point came after the French and Indian War, when Britain emerged victorious but deeply in debt. For the first time, the British government began to see the American colonies not just as partners in empire, but as financial assets that must help pay for imperial defense. New taxes followed: the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, each one designed to raise revenue and tighten control. To British lawmakers, these taxes seemed reasonable. To the colonists, they felt like a betrayal. For decades, local assemblies had controlled taxation. Now Parliament, an institution thousands of miles away in which colonists had no representation, was asserting authority over their wallets and their daily lives. The famous phrase "no taxation without representation" was not merely a slogan, it captured a real and growing sense of political suffocation. Yet even in this early phase, the colonies were not united in opposition. Merchants feared economic ruin. Lawyers feared the erosion of colonial legal rights. Farmers worried about rising debt. Urban workers feared unemployment as trade slowed. But wealthy landowners often feared something else entirely, that chaos, protest, and mob violence might threaten their own power and property more than British rule ever could. In southern colonies especially, many elites hesitated to embrace rebellion too quickly, worried that the same revolutionary language of liberty might one day be turned against the institution of slavery itself. From the very beginning, resistance to Britain meant different things to different groups, and that difference would shape the revolution's internal fractures. As protests grew, so did radicalization. In cities like Boston, resistance turned increasingly physical. British tax collectors were harassed. Officials were intimidated. Mobs filled the streets. The Sons of Liberty emerged as both a revolutionary force and a symbol of political violence. To patriots, they were heroes standing up to tyranny. To loyalists, they were dangerous extremists destabilizing society. The Boston Massacre in 1770 and the Boston Tea Party in 1773 were not spontaneous explosions. They were the result of years of escalating tension where protest, propaganda, and punishment collided again and again. Britain responded with the Intolerable Acts, tightening its control over Massachusetts and effectively punishing the entire colony for resistance. This response shocked many colonists who had previously hoped for compromise. For the first time, the idea that Britain might rule through force rather than partnership became terrifyingly real. Still, the path toward revolution was not straightforward. Even as tensions rose, many colonial leaders continued to hope for reconciliation. They sent petitions. They debated reform. They appealed to the king's sense of justice. Independence was not yet inevitable, it was still seen by many as unthinkable, even dangerous. Britain was not just a government, it was the world's greatest military and economic power. To break away meant risking invasion, economic collapse, and the destruction of colonial society. Families had deep ties to England. Trade depended on British markets. Culture, law, and identity were rooted in British tradition. The idea of severing those ties felt, to many, like stepping into a void. What changed everything was not just taxation, but the slow realization that Britain no longer saw the colonies as partners at all. British troops were stationed permanently in American cities. Colonial governors were overridden. Courts were dissolved. Assemblies were suspended. The message was unmistakable: authority flowed in one direction, down from London. For a growing number of colonists, this was no longer a dispute over laws or taxes, but a question of dignity, autonomy, and survival. Resistance was no longer just political, it became existential, yet even as the revolutionary movement gained momentum, unity remained fragile. The First Continental Congress in 1774 was not a revolutionary council, it was a desperate attempt to coordinate a response without crossing the point of no return. Delegates arrived with vastly different goals. Some demanded independence. Others begged for reconciliation. Some wanted economic boycotts. Others feared war. Many distrusted one another intensely. Colonies competed for influence. Old regional rivalries surfaced immediately. Behind polite speeches were private fears that rivals might seize power under the cover of revolution. Meanwhile, colonial society itself was tearing apart. Loyalists, those who remained faithful to the crown, were not a small fringe. They included merchants, officials, clergy, farmers, and even former patriots who recoiled from the growing violence. Patriot mobs targeted loyalist homes. Loyalists reported rebels to British authorities. Families split along political lines. Neighbors turned into enemies. The revolution was becoming not just a struggle against Britain, but a war within American communities themselves. The arrival of British troops and the outbreak of violence at Lexington and Concord in 1775 transformed political resistance into armed conflict. But even after blood was shed, the meaning of that violence was disputed. Some leaders saw it as proof that war was unavoidable. Others still clung to the hope that force might pressure Britain into compromise. It would take more than a year of fighting, famine, propaganda, and fear before a majority of colonial leaders openly supported full independence. It was Thomas Paine's common sense that finally shifted the emotional center of gravity. Written in plain language and distributed widely, it reframed the conflict not as a legal dispute with Parliament but as a moral struggle against monarchy itself. Paine challenged the very idea that a distant king had the right to rule free people across an ocean. His words ignited public imagination and pushed independence into the realm of common discussion rather than elite theory. But even then, support was not uniform. Paine's pamphlet inspired enthusiasm, but it also provoked fear. Many colonists still wondered whether liberty was worth civil war, invasion, and economic ruin. In truth, the movement toward revolution was never driven by a single unified vision. It moved forward in uneven surges, some colonies racing ahead, others dragged reluctantly along. Radical leaders pushed the pace. Moderates tried to slow it down. Loyalists resisted from within. Ordinary people struggled simply to survive amid collapsing trade, rising prices, and growing violence. The revolution was not a neatly organized march, it was a messy, dangerous, uncontrolled acceleration toward a future no one could fully predict. By the time independence was formally declared in 1776, the colonies were not united by deep agreement, they were united by a narrowing set of choices. Britain had closed the door on compromise. War had already come. Loyalty to the crown now carried deadly consequences. Neutrality had become impossible. Independence, once radical and terrifying, now appeared to many as the least dangerous remaining option, and yet even at this moment, the foundations of division were firmly in place. Regional interests clashed. Economic classes mistrusted one another. Slavery remained unresolved. Power was contested. The revolution had begun not as a unified uprising of a single people, but as a convergence of different fears, different hopes, and different ambitions forced into alignment by circumstance. This fragile beginning would shape everything that followed. When the American Revolution moved from protest into open warfare, it did not suddenly transform divided colonies into a harmonious brotherhood. Instead, the revolution entered its most fragile and dangerous phase, where victory seemed impossible, unity was constantly threatened, and the very men who would later be immortalized as the Founding Fathers were often locked in bitter disagreement, quiet rivalry, and open mistrust. The Continental Congress, which served as the political heart of the rebellion, was not a united government. It was a fragile coalition of delegates from 13 suspicious colonies, each fiercely protective of its own interests. These men did not arrive as loyal servants of a single nation, because no nation yet existed. They arrived as representatives of rival provinces, shaped by different economies, cultures, and visions of the future. George Washington was appointed commander of the Continental Army not because everyone fully trusted him, but because he represented political balance. As a wealthy Virginian, he helped unite Southern colonies with the New England heart of the rebellion. He was tall, dignified, experienced in frontier warfare, and respected for his discipline. But Washington was also insecure, cautious, and painfully aware of his army's weaknesses. He inherited a force that was not truly an army at all, just a patchwork of militias, volunteers, and short-term soldiers with little training, inconsistent equipment, and almost no reliable supply system. Desertion was constant. Hunger was widespread. Disease spread faster than bullets. Washington fought not only the British, but exhaustion, fear, and the quiet despair that threatened to dissolve his forces before a single decisive victory could be won. Meanwhile, inside Congress, leadership was fractured by sharp personalities and ideological differences. John Adams burned with revolutionary certainty and relentless energy. He was brilliant, outspoken, and deeply committed to independence, but his bluntness and impatience earned him just as many enemies as admirers. Adams believed that hesitation was equal to betrayal, and his mistrust of moderates often intensified internal divisions. Thomas Jefferson, in contrast, was quiet, philosophical, and deeply private. He believed in liberty as a natural right but feared confrontation and public conflict. While Adams argued loudly for independence, Jefferson withdrew inward, shaping the ideas that would define the revolution from the safety of written words rather than open debate. Benjamin Franklin stood apart from both men. Older, wiser, and deeply experienced in global diplomacy, Franklin saw the revolution through an international lens. He understood that the colonies could not defeat Britain alone, and he placed immense faith in the possibility of French support. But his charm, secrecy, and willingness to compromise made him a figure of suspicion among some revolutionaries. To Adams, Franklin sometimes appeared too comfortable in foreign courts. To purists, he seemed too flexible with principle. And yet without Franklin's diplomacy, the revolution may well have collapsed under British military dominance. Even within the military leadership, unity was a myth. Officers were appointed through political influence rather than purely by skill. Rival generals undermined Washington behind his back. Some actively sought to replace him. The most dangerous moment of internal betrayal came with the so-called Conway Cabal, a whispered conspiracy among officers and politicians who believed Washington was unfit for command. Though the plot never fully materialized, its existence revealed how fragile Washington's authority truly was. He was not universally trusted, he was tolerated because no better alternative existed. The early years of the war were marked by repeated disaster for the Continental Army. After initial clashes at Lexington and Concord, the British captured New York with overwhelming force. Washington's army was pushed into retreat after retreat. Soldiers fled. Supplies vanished. Morale collapsed. Many enlistments expired at the end of each year, forcing Washington to rebuild his army over and over again from near nothing. In camp, men froze without blankets. They marched barefoot through snow. They starved while Congress debated how, or whether, to fund the war effort. The image of a united Revolutionary Army was a fiction created after survival. In reality, the Army barely functioned as an institution. Beyond the battlefield, American society was unraveling. Loyalists, those who stood by the crown, were everywhere. They advised British commanders, sabotaged Patriot supply routes, and resisted revolutionary authority. Patriots responded with confiscation of property, public humiliation, imprisonment, and exile. The revolution devoured its own communities. Civilians were caught between both sides, never fully safe. No neighborhood, no town, no family remained untouched by political division. The idea that Americans were united in purpose collapses entirely when one confronts the brutal reality that Americans were also hunting, imprisoning, and killing one another. The early years of the Revolution also exposed the deepest contradictions of the cause. Leaders spoke of liberty while millions remained enslaved. Black Americans fled to British lines in hopes of freedom promised by the Crown. Some fought for the British. Others fought for the Patriots. Many were betrayed by both. Native American nations were drawn into the conflict, often siding with Britain in hopes of halting colonial expansion. The revolution that claimed to fight tyranny was also a war of displacement, broken promises, and competing freedoms that could not yet coexist. It is within this chaos that the Founding Fathers were forced to operate. They were not architects standing calmly over blueprints. They were crisis managers reacting to disaster after disaster. Trust was thin. Fear was constant. Rumors of betrayal spread rapidly. Ambition flourished in the shadows of uncertainty. Some leaders dreamed sincerely of a republic built on equality. Others primarily sought to preserve status, wealth, and power under a new banner. These competing motivations were never fully reconciled, and yet, despite this relentless instability, something extraordinary occurred. The revolution did not collapse. It bent under pressure, fractured under strain, and nearly vanished in despair, but it survived. Washington held his shattered army together through sheer force of will. Adams fought tirelessly for diplomatic recognition. Franklin secured the alliance that changed the course of the war. Jefferson gave voice to ideas that transcended the battlefield. Their unity was not emotional, it was functional. They did not move forward because they always trusted one another. They moved forward because collapse would mean imprisonment, execution, disgrace, and the destruction of their political lives. By the end of the Revolution's early phase, victory still seemed far away. The British remained enormously powerful. The colonies were exhausted. The economy was collapsing. Faith in the cause flickered like a candle in heavy wind. What held the movement together was not shared vision alone, but shared vulnerability. They were bound not just by hope, but by the terrifying fact that retreat was no longer possible. The bridge to British rule had already been burned. The Founding Fathers were becoming legends in the making, but in their own time, they were deeply uncertain men navigating disaster with imperfect tools, divided loyalties, and fragile alliances. They were not united in dream. They were united in danger. And in that danger, history was being shaped. By the winter of 1776, the American Revolution stood at the edge of extinction. What had begun with defiant speeches, ringing bells, and bold declarations now teetered on the brink of collapse. The early optimism that followed the Declaration of Independence had evaporated under the harsh weight of military defeat, hunger, desertion, and despair. The British Army had driven Washington out of New York with humiliating ease. One defeat followed another as the Continental Army retreated across New Jersey, chased relentlessly by seasoned British and Hessian forces. Cities fell. Supplies vanished. Soldiers slipped away under the cover of darkness, returning to their homes rather than dying for a cause that now seemed doomed. Enlistments were expiring by the thousands. The revolution, once loud and confident, was fading into silence. Inside the patriot cause, fear spread faster than hope. Many ordinary Americans began to believe that independence had been a terrible mistake. Loyalists grew bolder, openly supporting the British as the likely victors. British commanders believed the rebellion was nearly crushed. And in truth, they were not wrong. Washington commanded barely a few thousand exhausted, underfed, half-frozen men. The army had little food, little clothing, little ammunition, and almost no pay. The ideals of liberty meant little to soldiers who marched barefoot through snow-tracked roads stained with blood. Hunger made philosophers out of idealists, and deserters out of patriots. Even in Congress, faith in victory was wavering. Delegates quietly fled Philadelphia as the British advanced. Some whispered of negotiating a settlement. Others prepared to escape into exile if the rebellion collapsed. The unity proclaimed in speeches dissolved into quiet panic. The revolution, it seemed, might not be remembered as the birth of a nation, but as a tragic and reckless gamble that shattered the colonies beyond repair. It was in this darkest hour that George Washington faced the greatest decision of his life. He knew that if the army dissolved completely, the revolution would die with it. Yet he also understood that another defeat would be fatal, not just militarily, but psychologically. The only weapon he still possessed was surprise. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington ordered a desperate, nearly suicidal maneuver. In the freezing darkness, amid floating ice and violent winter winds, his army crossed the Delaware River. Many soldiers lacked proper shoes. Some wrapped their feet in rags. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes before any musket was fired. The crossing itself was a test of endurance more than strategy. At dawn on December 26, Washington attacked the unsuspecting Hessian garrison at Trenton. The victory was swift, shocking, and electric. It was not a grand conquest. It did not end the war. But psychologically, it changed everything. For the first time in months, the Continental Army had defeated a professional European force. The belief that the British were invincible shattered in that cold morning's light. Soldiers re-enlisted. Civilians regained hope. Congress breathed again. The revolution did not triumph at Trenton, but it survived, yet this turning point did not create unity. It created necessity. The revolutionaries did not suddenly trust one another more. They simply realized that survival was again possible, and therefore worth fighting for. The fragile alliance between rival leaders, jealous states, and clashing ideologies continued not because of harmony, but because defeat was no longer inevitable. The war entered a new phase, defined not by desperation alone, but by endurance. Soon after, another force altered the balance of power forever: France. For years, Benjamin Franklin labored in European courts, presenting the American struggle not as a colonial rebellion, but as a philosophical revolution, an ideological challenge to monarchy itself. The French saw opportunity where Americans saw survival. France desired revenge against Britain for past defeats and sought to weaken its global rival. After the American victory at Saratoga in 1777, which proved that the colonies could defeat British forces in open battle, France declared its formal alliance with the United States. French money, weapons, ships, and soldiers transformed the war. What had begun as a colonial uprising now became a global conflict. Britain was forced to divide its military power between multiple theaters of war. For the Americans, foreign alliance was both a miracle and a danger. Many leaders feared dependence on France. Others mistrusted foreign influence altogether. Some wondered whether they had traded one empire for another. Once again, the revolution moved forward not through collective agreement, but through uneasy acceptance of a necessary risk. Even as fortunes shifted, internal divisions deepened. The military struggled continuously with unpaid wages, food shortages, and inadequate supplies. At Valley Forge, the army suffered one of the most brutal winters of the war. Men starved. Men froze. Disease killed more soldiers than British bullets. Washington watched his army decay before his eyes. And yet, through discipline, training, and suffering, those survivors emerged hardened into a real fighting force. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, drilled the troops into professional soldiers. Out of misery came transformation, but hardship also bred resentment. Soldiers who had sacrificed everything watched Congress delay payment. Officers felt disrespected. Rumors of betrayal poisoned morale. The Conway cabal, the whispered suggestion that Washington be replaced, spread through political circles and military camps alike. Though it never fully erupted, it revealed just how fragile Washington's authority truly remained, even after survival at Trenton and endurance at Valley Forge. Victory had not erased doubt. Success had not created unity. Only fear of total collapse prevented open fracture. Meanwhile, at the political level, independence itself was being redefined. Early revolutionary rhetoric focused on freedom from British oppression. But as years passed, a deeper question emerged: what would replace British rule? There was no single answer. Some wanted a strong central government. Others feared centralized power above all things. Some envisioned a democratic republic. Others feared mass rule as a road to chaos. Northern interests clashed with Southern interests. Large states battled small states. Merchants battled farmers. The war for independence was still being fought, but a silent war for the future of American power was already underway. The turning point of the revolution, then, was not a single battle, nor a single victory. It was the slow recognition that the rebellion had crossed beyond the point of retreat. After Trenton. After Saratoga. After the French alliance. After Valley Forge. After years of suffering and survival. The revolution had become real, not just an idea, but a force that could no longer be undone without catastrophe. The stakes were now absolute. Victory or annihilation. Sovereignty or execution for treason. There was no middle path left. It is here that the myth of unity grows strongest in memory, because this is where survival began to look like destiny. But history shows something else. The revolution did not coalesce into harmony, it hardened into endurance. The Founding Fathers continued to argue, maneuver, and distrust each other even as they moved forward together. They were bound by a shared danger, not by identical dreams. By the end of this turning point, the revolution was no longer merely resisting. It was advancing, slowly, painfully, and at tremendous cost. The odds had shifted. The possibility of victory had emerged from the shadow of annihilation. But the divisions at the heart of the movement had not healed. They had merely learned to operate beneath the surface, waiting for a future moment when war would no longer demand cooperation. That future was approaching. The revolution had survived its darkest winter. It now moved toward its most violent, most triumphant, and most politically dangerous phase. The peak of conflict loomed ahead, and with it, the ultimate test of whether survival alone could still hold together a movement born from division. By the late years of the American Revolution, the struggle had entered its most intense and defining phase. The war was no longer a desperate gamble for survival, it had become a brutal contest of endurance, strategy, and political will. The Continental Army was no longer the shattered force that fled across New Jersey in terror. It had become disciplined, hardened, and determined. With French alliance, improved training, and battlefield experience, the Americans could now stand against the British in sustained conflict. Yet with this rising strength came not peace or unity, but deeper internal strain, growing political conflict, and the dangerous temptation of power. As fighting intensified across the colonies, the war consumed everything in its path. Cities were burned. Farmland was destroyed. Trade collapsed. Inflation exploded. Paper currency became nearly worthless. Civilian suffering reached unbearable levels. The revolution that once promised liberty now delivered hunger, fear, and economic collapse to ordinary families. While leaders spoke of independence, the people experienced uncertainty. Support for the war rose and fell with each battle's outcome. Victory on the battlefield did not guarantee loyalty at home. The British adapted their strategy, shifting focus southward, believing that loyalist support would be stronger in the Carolinas and Georgia. What followed was among the most violent and chaotic phases of the entire war. Patriot and loyalist militias slaughtered each other in brutal guerrilla warfare. There were no clear front lines, only raids, executions, and retaliations that tore communities apart. The war became intensely personal. Neighbors hunted neighbors. Brothers faced brothers. Entire regions descended into lawless vengeance disguised as political loyalty. The idea of national unity vanished completely in the shadow of survival. Even as American forces gained ground, internal discipline nearly collapsed. Soldiers who had endured years of unpaid service reached their breaking point. Mutinies broke out in New Jersey and Pennsylvania as troops demanded wages that Congress could not deliver. Officers feared that the army they had built might now turn inward, using its hard-won power against the very nation it was supposed to defend. For a brief, terrifying moment, the American Revolution stood on the edge of becoming a military dictatorship born from desperation. It was in this moment that George Washington performed one of the most important acts of restraint in world history. He refused to use force against his own men. He appealed to their loyalty, their sacrifice, and their belief in the cause. He reminded them that if the army abandoned civilian authority, then everything they had suffered for would be meaningless. The mutinies subsided not because power crushed rebellion, but because restraint preserved trust. In that fragile balance between force and principle, the future of American civil-military relations was quietly forged. Meanwhile, political conflicts within Congress intensified as the prospect of victory moved closer. Independents had once unified rival colonies through shared danger. Now, as the end of British rule approached, old battles over power, money, land, and influence resurfaced with new ferocity. Large states wanted greater representation. Small states feared being dominated. Northern states prioritized commerce and industry. Southern states demanded protections for slavery-based agriculture. Western lands promised wealth to some and displacement to others. Everyone wanted freedom, but no one fully agreed on what freedom meant. The conflict between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson emerged as one of the most consequential political fractures in American history. Hamilton envisioned a strong central government, a national bank, and powerful federal authority capable of unifying the nation through economic strength. Jefferson feared that such power would replicate the tyranny of Britain under a new name. He believed in local control, agricultural independence, and minimal central authority. This was not merely a policy debate, it was a collision between two incompatible visions of the American future. The war was still raging, but the ideological battle for control of the new nation had already begun. On the battlefield, the final act of the war approached with slow inevitability. British General Cornwallis moved his forces into Virginia, believing his position to be secure. What followed was the culmination of years of suffering, sacrifice, and strategy. In 1781, American and French forces trapped Cornwallis at Yorktown. French naval power blocked British escape by sea. Washington's army closed in from land. Cannon thundered day and night. Cornwallis's forces, battered and surrounded, faced the impossible. When the British surrendered at Yorktown, the war was effectively over. Though fighting would continue in scattered form for 2 more years, the outcome was now certain. The world's greatest empire had been defeated by its own colonies. Celebrations erupted across America. Church bells rang. Bonfires filled the streets. The impossible had become real. The United States of America now existed not just in words, but in victory, and yet, beneath the celebrations, something darker lingered. The unity forged by war began to unravel almost immediately. Soldiers expected long-promised payment. Congress had none to give. Veterans returned home broke, wounded, and forgotten. Officers feared the government they had defended would abandon them. Shays' Rebellion loomed just beyond the war's end, proof that victory did not guarantee stability. The poor and indebted rebelled not against Britain, but against their own Republican government. Politically, wartime alliances collapsed into bitter rivalries. Former brothers in arms became enemies in government halls. Ideological factions hardened into political camps. Federalists and anti-federalists battled for control of the nation's direction. The myth of unity shattered under the weight of power. Even the founding fathers themselves fell into open conflict. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, once united in revolutionary diplomacy, became bitter political adversaries. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's rivalry ended in blood. Washington, exhausted by conflict, warned in his farewell address that political factions would tear the nation apart. He was not predicting a possibility, he was diagnosing a reality already in motion. The greatest challenge of the Revolution's peak was not defeating Britain. It was answering a question no army could solve: who would rule now that the king was gone? Victory had removed the external enemy, but it had exposed the internal struggle for power. Without Britain to oppose, Americans now turned on one another to define the future. The war had been fought in the language of unity. The peace would be fought in the language of politics. Even independence itself was incomplete and unequal. Millions remained enslaved. Native nations were displaced. Women were denied political rights. The revolution that promised freedom had delivered it unevenly and imperfectly. The contradictions between ideals and reality became permanent features of the American story. The peak of the revolution, then, was not its moment of greatest unity, but its moment of greatest tension. It was the point where military victory collided with political uncertainty. Where triumph met unresolved conflict. Where a nation was born not in harmony, but in argument. America had defeated an empire. But it had not defeated its internal divisions. Those divisions would now shape the final and most dangerous phase of the revolution, the moment when winning the war was no longer enough, and building a nation became the true battle, when the guns finally fell silent and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the American Revolution officially came to an end, but the struggle that followed may have been even more dangerous than the war itself. The enemy that had once unified the colonies was gone. The British flag no longer flew over American soil. For the first time, the people of the former colonies faced a terrifying reality: they were alone. Free, victorious, and completely uncertain of what came next. The unity that had existed during the war, however fragile, now began to dissolve under the weight of peace. Without a common enemy, the old divisions, rivalries, and unresolved questions surged back to the surface with renewed force. The first American government under the Articles of Confederation revealed just how divided the new nation truly was. The central government was deliberately made weak, reflecting the deep fear of centralized power that had grown out of British rule. Congress had no authority to tax, no standing army to enforce laws, and little control over the states. Each state functioned almost like an independent country, protecting its own interests, issuing its own currency, and pursuing its own economic policy. Cooperation quickly deteriorated into competition. Trade wars erupted between states. Borders became points of dispute. Inflation spiraled out of control. The very independence that had been so fiercely fought for now threatened to tear the nation apart from the inside. Veterans who had sacrificed everything during the war returned home to find themselves unpaid, unemployed, and forgotten. Promises made on the battlefield dissolved in political arguments. Debt crushed farmers. Courts seized land. Jails filled with men who had once fought for liberty. The contradiction was unbearable. A nation founded on freedom was now imprisoning its own revolutionaries for financial ruin. This tension exploded in 1786 with Shays' Rebellion, when thousands of desperate farmers rose up in armed protest against state governments that they believed had betrayed them. To the elites, it was a terrifying warning that democracy might devour itself. To the poor, it was proof that the revolution had failed to deliver justice. For many leaders, Shays' Rebellion became the final proof that the loosely united states could not survive without a stronger central government. Yet even this realization did not create harmony. It produced another battlefield, this time not with muskets, but with words, fear, and ideology. In 1787, representatives gathered in Philadelphia for what became the Constitutional Convention. Officially, the goal was to revise the Articles of Confederation. In reality, they had come to dismantle it entirely. The convention was conducted in secrecy for a reason. What unfolded inside was not unity, it was relentless conflict. Large states fought small states over representation. Northern states clashed with southern states over slavery. Wealthy elites feared mass democracy. Poor citizens feared a new aristocracy. Every clause of the Constitution was born from compromise, not agreement. The infamous 3/5 compromise did not resolve slavery, it preserved it. Representation was split between population and state equality not because anyone fully agreed, but because without compromise, the nation would fracture instantly. The Constitution was not the product of shared vision, it was the product of mutual fear. Even after the Constitution was written, it was far from universally accepted. The ratification battle unleashed a bitter ideological civil war fought through newspapers, pamphlets, and public debate. Federalists, led by figures like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, argued that a strong central government was essential for survival. Anti-Federalists, including Patrick Henry and George Mason, warned that the Constitution threatened the very liberties the Revolution had been fought to secure. They feared tyranny reborn under an American name. The nation once again stood divided, not by empire, but by its own future. The Bill of Rights emerged not as a generous gift from unity, but as a concession forced by resistance. Freedom of speech, religion, press, and due process were not added because all agreed, they were added because without them, the Constitution might have collapsed entirely. Even in the act of founding a government, America remained a nation stitched together by reluctant compromise. Then came the final, painful truth: the Founding Fathers themselves did not remain united. Once allies in revolution, many became lifelong enemies. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, once bound in diplomacy and independence, became bitter political rivals. Their split symbolized the deep fractures that had always existed beneath the surface. Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's rivalry ended not in debate, but in a deadly duel. Washington, the one figure capable of commanding near universal respect, left office deliberately, fearing that staying longer would turn the presidency into a monarchy. In his farewell address, he issued a warning that now reads like prophecy, that political parties and factionalism would become the greatest threat to the republic, and indeed, factionalism became permanent. The revolution that had promised liberty had not resolved its deepest contradictions. Slavery continued to expand. Native American lands were seized through force and broken treaties. Women, who had sustained families and businesses through the war, remained excluded from political power. The new nation that emerged was independent, but it was not equal, not just, and not unified in the way its founding myth would later claim. Yet despite all of this, something extraordinary endured. The United States did not collapse. Against every historical expectation, the same deeply divided people who had barely held themselves together during war managed to hold together in peace. Governors argued with Congress. Congress battled the president. States clashed with federal authority. Political parties rose, fought, and survived one another. The nation stumbled forward not through shared perfection, but through continuous conflict managed through law rather than violence. That may be the most radical achievement of the Founding Fathers, not that they were united, but that they built a system capable of surviving division. Over time, the myth of unity grew stronger than the truth. Statues were raised. Paintings were commissioned. Schoolbooks softened the bitterness of political warfare into gentle disagreements. The revolution was rewritten as a smooth march toward destiny rather than the brutal, uncertain, near failure it truly was. Why? Because nations need stories that hold them together. And a story of unity is far easier to pass down than a story of fragile survival. But today, when America once again finds itself divided, the true history of its founding becomes more important than ever. The Founding Fathers were not united in ideology, religion, economics, geography, or even in their definitions of freedom. They were united only by a shared, urgent realization: if they did not work together, everything would be lost. Their achievement was not that they eliminated division. It was that they built a nation strong enough to live with it. The American Revolution was not the triumph of perfect unity over tyranny. It was the triumph of temporary cooperation over permanent collapse. It was not built on harmony, it was built on compromise, fear, ambition, endurance, and the relentless struggle to prevent disagreement from turning into destruction. So, were the Founding Fathers actually united? The honest answer is no. They were divided by class, by region, by politics, by vision, by ambition, and by morality. They argued fiercely. They betrayed each other politically. Some even killed each other. And yet, against every probability, They held the fragile structure together long enough for a nation to take its first breath. Their true legacy is not the myth of unity, it is the reality that a divided people, when forced by survival, can still create something enduring. In that struggle, the tension between division and cooperation did not end in 1783. It is the story of America itself.